Welcome to episode 10 in our series on Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto's The Path of the Just. And we're up to chapter 10, and we've reached the rung in this ladder, the rung of the virtue of cleanliness. We've already climbed up the first two, which were vigilance, which centered around the negative commandments, how we have to be vigilant against giving in to them. And then the next rung up was alacrity or vigor or zeal, which dealt with how we should perform our positive commandments, how we should be quick to perform them and live life on the front foot, so to speak. So now we've completed those two steps, we've moved up a rung to the concept of cleanliness, and this is removing the kind of moss from our souls, cleansing ourselves of our perhaps indifferent pasts, and purifying ourselves for God. And in this chapter, we're going to talk about the various virtues of cleanliness. So let's begin. The Ramchal begins. The virtue of cleanliness is associated with a person who has completely cleansed himself of all bad traits and all sin. This means not only those sins that are acknowledged as such and are clearly recognizable, but also those that the heart has been seduced into rationalizing as permissible. In actuality, when we look into the matter, we will discover that the only reason one considers these things permissible is because his heart is still slightly afflicted by lustful desire. He is not entirely cleansed of it, and therefore it is able to entice him towards leniency. So I'm sure all of us can recognize this tendency to, when we have some sort of desires or any other wants that perhaps are outright wrong or borderline wrong. I think the Ramchal here is trying to stress that the things sometimes we think are not that bad. Perhaps how we treat our bodies, not hurting our bodies willfully by making excuses. We should realize that our bodies are really our kind of vehicle for our souls. And if you consider that God is part of our soul, we have to keep his surroundings in perfect shape. And this means not smoking or any other destructive habits that we kind of say are not that bad, but in reality they are terrible and they should be stamped out. If you wish to be a purified servant of God, you have to cut out everything that is even mildly bad for you. So this, I'm sure we can think of many things that all of us have done in the past that perhaps we realize now are not good for us, and we were reminded this is not only a mental cleanliness, this is a physical cleanliness. These are desires or lusts or various other things that we have to keep in check and also have total control over. You know, if you really consider yourself a true servant of God, you don't have any half measures in your attitude towards that goal. You must be perfect. You have to aim for perfection. And although that's difficult, it's the right thing to aim for. With this, and the Ramchal continues, but a person who is thoroughly cleansed of this blemish and any trace of evil that desire leaves in its wake will be sharp-eyed and keenly discerning, and he will not be swayed in any manner. Therefore, he will be able to recognize as evil anything that could be a sin, even the most minor of sins, and he will distance himself from it. Accordingly, the sages, and he quotes from Sanhedrin 23a, referred to those who have so completely purified their actions that not even a stirring of evil remains, as, and I quote, the clean mind of Jerusalem. You can now see the difference between one who possesses the virtue of vigilance and one who possesses the virtue of cleanliness, even though they are similar to each other in their makeup. The vigilant person is one who is careful about his actions and makes sure not to sin in those areas that are already known to him and that are universally acknowledged as sin. However, such a person is not sufficiently mastered over himself to prevent himself from being emotionally drawn towards his innate desire, which then misleads him by permitting him those things whose evil is not widely known. This means that although he tries to conquer his evil inclination and subdue his desires, this will not change his very nature, and he will still be incapable of removing corporeal lust from his heart. All he can do is sublimate it and pursue wisdom rather than lust. But the darkness of corporeality is nevertheless effective in swaying him and enticing him. So the Ramchal is teaching us that, however effective our mindset is, sometimes it's very difficult to change your kind of inner nature, but he's telling you to go for it and take it a step further and try and sublimate it completely. And now the Ramchal is going to describe how one should habituate oneself to vigilance and alacrity, because this leads to cleanliness. So the Ramchal continues. However, once a person has accustomed himself to vigilance, by undergoing a primary cleansing of the acknowledged sins, by performing the service of the eternal with regularity and alacrity, and by intensifying his love and longing for the eternal, then the power of these habits will distance him from corporeal matters, and his mind will cleave to the spiritual perfection that will ultimately lead him to the perfection of cleanliness. The fire of physical desire will be extinguished from his heart, and the spiritual longing intensifies, and his perception will remain clear and lucid, as I have written previously. Consequently, he will not be enticed, nor will he be affected by his corporeal wants, and his actions will be completely cleansed. King David rejoiced over his possession of this virtue and declared in his Psalms, and chapter 22, verse 6, I wash my hands in cleanliness and encircle your altar, O Eternal. Only one who has been completely cleansed of any stirring of sin and transgression is worthy of seeing the countenance of the King, the Eternal. Anyone deficient in this can only feel embarrassment and shame before his presence, as Ezra HaSopher stated in Ezra 9 verse 6, My Lord, I am embarrassed and ashamed to raise my countenance towards you, my God. Without a doubt, a person will have to do a great deal of work in order to perfect this virtue. Those sins that are recognizable and known are easy for one to be careful about, since their ill effects are clearly recognizable. However, the meticulousness that cleanliness demands is more difficult, since the process of internal rationalization conceals the sin, as I have written. As our sages of blessed memory have taught us, and he quotes from Avodah Zarah 18a, the sins that one crushes with his heel encircle him at the time of judgment. In a similar vein, our sages of blessed memory said, and he quotes from Baba Basra 165a, the majority of people are guilty of theft, a minority are guilty of incest, and everyone is guilty of avak lashon hara. This is implied slander, translated as the dust of lashon hara. Due to the subtle nature of the last matter, all people fall into error, since they do not perceive the prohibitions involved. So that's very true. This dust of lashon hara, or implied slander, is everybody is guilty of it, but one must resist it. That's why vigilance, thinking before you speak, is very important, and avoiding even anything close to gossip is the correct way. It's not it's quite difficult, but it's not impossible. You just have to get used to it, and it's the right way to be. Better not to speak any type of Lashon Hara. There are plenty of other things to talk about with people. Now, the Ramchal is going to talk about King David's level of cleanliness. So he continues. Our sages of blessed memory also commented that King David was vigilant and cleansed himself thoroughly of all the aforementioned transgressions. As a result, he went to war with full confidence, requesting, this is quoted from Tehillim 18 verse 38, "Let me pursue my foes and overtake them, not to return until they are destroyed." Even though neither Yehoshaphat, Asa, nor Chizkiyahu even requested this, since they had not attained the same degree of cleanliness. As David himself indicates in this psalm, that's 18, this is 18:21. Reward me, O Eternal, in accord with my righteousness. Repay me in accord with the cleanliness of my hands. And he further says, and the Eternal has repaid me in accord with my righteousness, in accord with the cleanliness of my hands before his eyes. Which is reference to the purity and cleanliness that we mentioned previously. He returns to this theme further on in Psalms 18 verse 30. Trusting in you, I will run without fear to the enemy's camp, and with my God I will leap over the enemy's wall. And also from the same chapter, let me pursue my foes and overtake them. And it was also King David who adds in Psalms 24 verses 3 and 4, who may ascend the mountain of the Eternal, and who may stand in the place of his holiness? Only one with clean hands and a pure heart. This virtue is very difficult to attain, since man's nature is weak. His heart surrenders easily to temptation, and he permits himself those things whose faults he can rationalize. Someone who has acquired this virtue has unquestionably reached a lofty level, for he has withstood an intense war and emerged victorious. Let us now examine the details of this virtue. So that's the end of this chapter. Obviously, we're going to discuss the details of the virtue of cleanliness in the next chapter. But it's very, very important to mention that this concept of cleanliness is a far greater, as he describes, a battle than most other things. If we wish to not to murder somebody, it's not difficult because we know how wrong that is, and it's not part of our nature. But as a human being, one has desires and a kind of emotional side and a physical side, and it's almost ingrained in us to be at least a little bit of the sort of desire to desire things in life, but to be able to keep them in check is an internal war, and it's obviously possible to control them because we all do. So this is, but it's very important that it's not such an obvious one. It's kind of perhaps it simmers inside a human being, and it's something that the Ramchal describes as a war that one has to emerge victorious from, which is very, very true. So in the next chapter, chapter 11, we're going to discuss the specifics about the virtue of cleanliness.